Please be seated. Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to introduce this year's Kinmonth lecture on behalf of the Royal College of Surgeons of England. The John Kinmonth lecture is always one of the highlights of the meeting, and of course we missed it very much last year. But the list of previous speakers reads like a roll call of some of the greats of vascular surgery. And today's speaker fits the bill perfectly with that regard. Professor Hens Verhagen is Professor of Vascular Surgery at Erasmus University Medical Centre in Rotterdam. He has a remarkable track record in vascular surgery, with over 450 publications, multiple textbooks. He's been the PI of multiple international clinical studies, and throughout all of that has maintained a very busy clinical practice, running a wonderful unit in Rotterdam, but he always finds time for his family and his friends. He is a true ambassador for our speciality. There are many similarities between him and John Kinmonth, both well recognized as enthusiastic and internationally renowned educators, researchers, surgeons, and innovators, and it's the innovation that's the topic of the lecture today. So without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce to you Professor Hens Verhagen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Ian, for this very kind introduction. And thank you very much for having me. I mean, it's a true honor and pleasure to be here. And it wasn't easy. I have to thank a lot of people from the Vascular Society organization, like Gail and Fran, as well as your current president, for really doing everything possible to get me over. I mean, they reorganized my flights several times. I had to do extra testing, then testing was different, other locations, other times. It just didn't stop, and then we thought we had everything sorted out. And then yesterday morning, as most of you will know, all the rules changed again, so we were back at point zero. But I'm here, and I'm really, really honored, as I said, to give this talk. So here are my disclosures, and for today's talk, that's actually quite relevant. So I won't click them away immediately, but maybe, as you can see, I basically work with all the companies. So you might say that I actually am kind of unbiased because I work with everyone. So when I received the first email from Mike, he said something like, well, could you, something like to talk on the fine line between innovation, clinical involvement with industry, new device introduction, the governance of that, with the maintenance of professional standards and patient care. Well, I knew at that time immediately that it was probably not one of the more easy ones. This is probably one of the more difficult presentations I would give. So I have to thank a lot of people for this, because I couldn't think of this completely by myself. Some of them are noted here. Obviously, talking about innovations and industry roles means that I have to talk about regulation, laws, and procedures, and that by itself sometimes can be a little bit boring. I do the best I can to kind of keep on entertaining you. It's also about the difference between the USA and Europe, and that's actually quite complex. And obviously, due to Brexit, I really don't know where you guys stand at the moment. Maybe I'm quite certain you don't know it yourself. So let's talk about USA and Europe, and somewhere in between England will fit, I guess. Having a difficult subject also means that you can have serious blackouts. I think the sound's gone. It doesn't matter. You probably have seen it. This is a week or two ago, and he's just saying, forgive me, and he really didn't know what to say. So that can happen to me. On the other hand, look at the end of this.
Thank you for joining us.
He gets a big round of applause by basically saying nothing. So maybe I'm good at the end. So there are several reasons why I thought this is really an interesting subject. One of them actually was that it's completely new, for me as well. it takes me out of my comfort zone, something I find very important, and I try to teach my fellows and junior staff members. If you do everything the same every time, it probably went very well, but you don't know if other techniques and other ways to get there may be better. So you have to try different things. It makes you a better surgeon, and maybe by thinking about subjects that you don't think about every day, makes you a better surgeon and a better human being as well. Furthermore, I also struggle with involvement with industry, because on one hand, you really need them if you like innovation. Innovation doesn't come from physicians anymore. It's companies and nothing else, because otherwise it's just impossible to introduce. They desperately need clinical input, but it's kind of difficult to make sure that you're on the right side of that fine line so that everyone, including your colleagues, actually still trust you. The subject is very relevant, and especially because you've probably noticed that there's quite a few failed introductions of several new aortic endografts. And I observed recently that new technology was introduced in the US instead of Europe, where it used to be introduced. So there's a couple of key phases in the introduction of new devices. First, obviously, someone needs to have a great idea. Then there's a lot of preclinical testing. And then there's clinical approval, sometimes with, and strangely enough, sometimes without clinical data. At least that was what it used to be in Europe. And then the marketing machine starts running. So let's look at the EVAR history, how that process actually went. Anurex, Ancure, and Vanguard, the first FDA-approved and well-known endografts for the aorta. Well, Ancure taught us a lot, like that type 1A endoleaks exist, that there's breakage of top stents. Vanguard taught us that you actually need an overlap, otherwise you have an almost immediate type 1A endoleak. And Anurex, probably the most widely used endograft in the beginning, told us that there's something like migration, and that there's fabric tears, and there's breakage of stents. So these stents conquered the market very quickly, and basically completely failed, and left the market very quickly as well. If you look at EVAR device evolution up to, say, 2010 or 12 or 14 or so, you see that the same concept comes back, right? It's a bifurcated graft, they added some hooks on the top, the limbs became more flexible, but basically they look the same. And in a way, we, at least at that time, thought they were pretty successful. We knew that EVAR had durability issues, and we thought it was mainly the result of the implant to human tissue interaction and progression of natural disease. And it seemed like at least one of the key phases in the introduction of new devices had been pretty successful, because we did get rid of structural problems like migration, dislocation, fractures, and fabric tears. They were kind of not seen for 5 to 10 years or so, probably longer. So that battle was won. Probably and likely that was due to physician input, very important, and better understanding of the forces of what the device is up against. And probably better preclinical testing. Now, I don't know whether you've ever been to a large company and seeing their lab where they do preclinical testing. And I was disappointed. Actually, I'm always disappointed when I see it. It's rather small. It looks like a hobby room from a student where all kinds of different things are tested. Oh, sorry about that. I'll go because it will probably move. Here we go. So if you look at the left upper part, it does move, but it's difficult to see, but it kind of expands, and it goes very rapid. So if you take a rapid camera, you can slow it down, and then you will see that it actually movements like this. One of the many movements is tested, and they do it very, very rapidly, so you can have a 10-year cycle cramped into like 6 months or so. Otherwise, it would take forever. Right upper side, acute performance testing. Does the endograft actually follow the anatomy? Can you deploy it there? And on the bottom, there's this flow program. I mean, it looks pretty childish-like, but this is actually how it works. Can you deploy it without immediate migration? That's how they test these things. And we thought it was kind of okay what they did, right? Because we didn't see all these problems that we saw in the beginning. And then somehow people said low profile is the way forward. Not entirely sure who actually asked for that, because I'm not sure if we can treat more patients if we go from 18 to 14 French. And it basically seemed like an industry-driven rat race. I can go smaller than you can. So let's see how we went on with low profile. Well, this is a Cook Alpha. They basically solved it at the moment, but in the beginning there was lots of clotting issues and top stents that completely broke off. Endurant Evo didn't even make it to the market because of stent breakage, again, like we haven't seen for years, but it came back. Top stents completely getting loose. And very recently, a thoracic device, the Valiant device, was taken off the market because the stents became completely loose from the fabric, and the fabric broke all the way from top to bottom. Kind of old problems returning back to the market. Then you have this low-profile device called AFX, with very serious problems with the fabric. It kind of dissolved, and there was quite a few reports on this, where there were holes as big as you can see in this particular endograft. So companies basically turned the clock back by going low profile. So I'm not so sure if we do better testing, because those low profile stents were tested probably 100 times more and better and more intensive than the ones before. Maybe we got lucky with the ones before, but definitely preclinical testing is not good enough. Is there a reason to worry? Because those grafts, the ones that were kind of okay, they're in the body for like 5 to 10 years now. And if you look at a recent publication in the Annals of Surgery this year, you see that there is a very worrisome amount of reinterventions. British Journal, 2019, a big difference with open surgery. And on the lower part, you will see that people say, yeah, but the grafts do much better than a couple of years ago. Well, in this graft, it shows that they actually do exactly the same as a couple of years ago. We haven't progressed that much. So every generation of devices has shown failures. All of them were completely unpredicted, usually due to mechanical and biological unknowns. And the preclinical testing, as well as the approval process and clinical introduction, clearly failed to protect our patients. And they were all variations on the same subject. So maybe that's the reason why they fail. And then this completely new concept came along. Many of you have probably heard and seen about it. It's called NALIX. It was called NALIX, I should say. Just like EVAR itself, idea was revolutionary. It was kind of mind-blowing, great enthusiasm, basically by the whole kind of physician crowd that implanted them. And it was thought to have unlimited possibilities, like Anurex. You don't need a neck, you just put it in and it will be fine. Kind of the same. It was a real game changer. And the industry, as well as the physicians, kind of embraced that idea. Look at the front page of the Vascular News a couple of years ago. And then there were interviews with physicians. Our experience with the commercially available device has been outstanding, with 100% technical success, no secondary interventions, no aneurysm-related mortality. Freedom from secondary intervention and absence of endoleak is very appealing. And then probably the most important one, a particular appealing anatomy for this device is the conical infrarenal neck. Basically an aneurysm without a neck, right? Just like Anurex, right? And then history repeats itself. It's unbelievable that we didn't learn anything in about 20 years because we made the same mistakes. We put it in, we saw migration, we saw type 1A endoleaks, we saw enlargement of the aneurysm, separation of the limbs, ruptures, and conversions. Nothing new in 20 years. Kind of embarrassing, isn't it? So also us, the physicians, we turned the clock back as well. Probably important for today's talk is how did we find it out and when that the device wasn't up to our expectations. Which procedures were in place to make sure that structural problems were picked up as soon as possible? Just think about it. Right, not much, right? There was nothing, just implant and we'll see. It was mainly because physicians took the time and effort to notify the companies. The companies, after a couple of years, told the FDA, and then the FDA wakes up and they have publications like this. And that usually means the end of a device in its current form. So go back to the key phases of introduction of new devices. Again, great idea, preclinical testing, clinical approval and clinical data, and then nothing. We had basically nothing in place to prevent, or actually to make sure that failing devices were picked up very quickly. We did have a well-oiled marketing machine and plenty of fame-hungry physicians. Maybe one of them was myself. Has there been no evolution in this process? Well, yeah, there has been, because the clinical approval and clinical data changed significantly about 2-3 years ago, and I go into detail a little later then. And the introduction of post-approval registries, either company-sponsored, national, or administrative. So the question before this talk was, well, what are the regulations for medical devices, and did they change to improve patient protection or safety? Basically, what does it take to come from an idea to the introduction of a new medical device as safe as possible? Well, here's the idea, the original idea from Juan Parodi, and then the whole business machine starts running. And I'm pretty sure that not everyone realizes what it actually takes for a company to manufacture, eventually manufacture a graft. So first they go into, is there a market? Well, this is an expectation from about 2-3 years ago of a company of what money goes on into aortic surgery. It's a multi-billion-dollar market. So yeah, sure, there's a couple of companies interested in it, and then they kind of think, well, what's there to gain? How much money can we actually make if we go into that market? They come up with a strategic plan. They get information from third parties. Is there a need? Can we get funding? Can we make it? Does it actually fit into our own portfolio? And then sort of a circle starts. So first they start to see, is there any IP protecting this idea? And then in green, the R&D guys start manufacture it, they test it, manufacture it, adjust it a little bit, that goes on and on. And at the same time, in orange, the marketing team starts to work on this as well. How can we market this? How can we make sure that we actually sell this stuff? Interesting to know that 1/3 of R&D investments are wasted on invention that already exist. It's all waste of money, of course. So here's how that goes. So they have this preclinical testing and adjust. And like I said, the preclinical testing is probably not good enough. This is just part of everything they want to measure. You know, radial fatigue, longitudinal fatigue, pulsatile fatigue. The problem is we have no clue what kind of forces are on, for example, an aortic device or any device inside the human being. What happens if you cough, sneeze, if you start running? We have no idea, right? So they just imagine a test, discuss it with either CE or FDA, they approve it, and that's the test. It's not more than that. So then we go to clinical. So the whole clinical thing, so the studies you have to do before you can introduce the device is actually a lot of work. First, protocol development. What kind of study do we want to do with this? The site selection takes a lot of time. Ethics and review board submissions, a lot of money. Patient consent and enrollment, data collection, data analysis, interpretation, and finally, hopefully, a publication. This is about at least $100,000, euros, pounds, per patient. So a normal study, 150 patients, which is not a big study, 15 million, right? So how did I went with the Endurance, the one that is still on the market? I was global PI from that, so I was really closely involved. So for CE mark, we only needed 30 patients and a 30-day follow-up, right? So that was done in 7 months. FDA approval was more difficult, and that altogether took about 30 months. You have to realize that when in Europe Endurance was introduced, at that same month, the Talent graft was introduced in America. And we knew Talent failed, right? It had lots of migration and fabric holes in it. So then the whole regulatory thing starts off. So how does that work? Well, medical devices are regulated to ensure safety and efficacy. That's where they fall, right? FDA does that in America, EU does that in Europe. And countries like France and Japan usually are attached to either FDA or CE. You just follow a couple of years later. Both agencies have potential for competing goals because they want to have this innovation on the market as soon as possible. On the other hand, they need safety. So the EU arranges that for 28, probably 27 at the moment, countries. And basically that is developed, and not many people know that, to harmonize commerce between countries. So it's not so much a safety thing, it is the production process. Is that okay? And if I buy the graft last week, this week, or next week, will it be the same? That is basically what they look at. Not if it's truly safe. Very different. Therefore, it was quite rapid. FDA has a different philosophy, and that was developed primarily as a consumer protection agency. That's why it takes much longer. They classify all the medical implants or medical devices in class 1, 2, or 3. Class 1 being very simple stuff, 2 usually diagnostic, like a new ultrasound, and 3 is implants, whatever implant that is, something that stays in the body. And obviously, the third one is the most strict one. So looking at how this works in the CE mark process, very different from FDA, like I said, they make sure that the process is okay, not so much if the safety is okay. In contrast to the FDA, it has several ways, but in general, this kind of product usually is immediately approved. Then this one, you should just prove that is substantially equivalent, whatever that is. And the third one actually needs clinical data. That's why this takes so much longer than the CE mark. So basically, Europe got all the new and innovative products years before the USA, and the US had the patient numbers with which European centers could not compete. So that was for Europe a really good situation, right? Not sure, because then, a couple of years ago, the FDA said, well, there's a list of medical devices that are approved in the EU and not in the US. And later, they proved to be unsafe. We should do something about it. And then this pendulum in Europe completely changed to the other side. These are just a couple of examples of grafts approved in Europe and not in the States. So from June 2017, CE changed the way it approved implants, I should say. Clinical input was necessary, just like the FDA, but the problem was, the last line, all CE marked devices must recertify within 5 years to new requirements or be removed from the market. This means that small companies cannot have a device on the European market because it's unaffordable to do the same thing every 5 years. And I've already seen devices taken off the market, not because they are not good, but just because they can't follow these rules anymore. So this results in far longer approval timelines in Europe and fewer early clinical studies. The FDA, they didn't change anything. Actually, they made it easier for certain grafts. They had an early feasibility study, just proof of clinical concept. That's why these kinds of devices now are tested in the States and not anymore in Europe. So basically, the USA gets all the new and innovative products years before Europe, completely 180 degrees different than what it was, and the USA still has the patient numbers with which European centers cannot compete. So everybody is very unhappy in Europe, and it seriously hampers our possibility to be innovative. So maybe Brexit wasn't such a bad idea from this standpoint of view. So again, back to the key phases in the introduction of new devices. So we had the great idea, the preclinical testing, the approval and clinical data that changed just about 2-3 years ago, and then the introduction of post-approval registries. Should there be more? Is this enough to pick up this and to keep patients safe or not? Well, it isn't, and this is actually very new. 6-7 weeks ago, the FDA was really sick and tired of aortic endografts falling apart after a couple of years, and they found out years and years later with many, many patients at risk. And the reason they found that, I mean, there were several endografts, but now you had this AFX with holes in it, and they picked it up like 8 or 10 years later, and they said, this cannot go on like this. This has to change. So they had a panel, FDA on one side, physicians on the other side, and a couple of companies basically stuck in the middle. So we should do this differently. And this is interesting because this is going to be the future in my mind. We know that long-term imaging follow-up is standard practice for us, right? That's what we do. So one of the suggestions was, why don't we have an imaging database, a nationwide imaging database, so that we can pick up. It's like a core lab, right? They're watched by independent people, and then they can pick up problems very early. Right, it's going to be hugely costly, but potentially possible, I would say. Another suggestion was, why don't we go to a clinical registry? That's probably okay, except that after 5 years, probably 50% of the patients is not part of a follow-up program. So you will miss a large deal of those patients. And then someone came up with an idea, why do we use Medicare data to analyze EVAR re-intervention? Something that is not possible in Holland, potentially possible here in Britain, and definitely possible in the US. And you may have seen this very recent publication. It's called VQI, but Vision. Vision is the most important part. So you can read the details here. But basically what they do is they link VQI data to reimbursement data. And they have shown that that's actually far more reliable than I expected it to be. So here you can see that indeed the early endologics AFX showed far more reinterventions, basically significantly different from about 2 years or so, if you compare them with all the other devices. So it could have been picked up much, much earlier with this system than we could. Another thing, the FDA was afraid, they still got reports that there was, again, holes in the new AFX graft. And they said, oh, we're not going to do this again. They looked at it, it's actually not true. It's the same kind of reinterventions as all the other grafts. If you look at late rupture, you would also pick it up. Probably a year later, but you would have picked it up. Even more interesting, you can look at reintervention rate per device. Look at this one. I won't mention the names. A, B, C, D is more than enough, but you can see differences. So you can pick up much earlier than we can now if a graft is failing. So this is really an interesting thing that's going on there. So in summary, the road from an idea to clinical implantation is long, very complicated, and physician involvement is a key factor. The FDA and the EU manage device approval with competing requirements of ensuring patient safety on one side and access to innovative new technology on the other side. Preclinical device testing, as well as pre-approval clinical studies, don't seem to result in preventing serious patient safety issues enough. Recent EU approval changes extend approval times, while the FDA provides early feasibility studies to limit patient risk and collect early safety clinical data. What will the EU do to keep access to innovative products? I'm afraid they made this decision. It will take at least 10 or 20 years to kind of return it to what it was, or at least to some sort of regulation that we still have innovations, because at the moment we won't. Post-market registries have become the standard, often mandatory, but they also reveal patient safety issues relatively late and are often company-sponsored, which in this case I think is a problem. This vision kind of thing seems to be a significant improvement, but would this be possible in other countries? Not in Holland, that's for sure. And who will pay for this? Because it's going to be a huge cost. That has been part of the discussion as well, and industry has already said that they are willing to donate a huge amount of money to make sure that this will work in an independent kind of committee. Let's wait for that. At least this will make, it's very likely that it will make, that it will keep our patients more safe than they are now. Thank you so much.
Hans, thank you. A wonderful insight into our past and our future. We're extremely grateful for you coming. I would normally now present you with the Kinmonth medal, But as with everything at the moment, that's been held up somewhere, presumably by a combination of COVID, Brexit and the rest. But our President, Mike Jenkins, does have something else he'd like to present to you.
So hence, I would like personally to thank you for the massive effort you made to get into our country last night, and to apologise you had to self-isolate while the rest of us were eating and drinking at the President's dinner. You've made a massive effort. This is an honorary fellowship of the Society of Vascular Surgery for Great Britain and Ireland. You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And if you'd be upstanding for the procession.